It's 6 in the morning. The street is still dark, but there's a sound, the soft hum of tires on asphalt, followed by the clinking of glass bottles. The milk truck has arrived. The year is 1962, and in millions of American homes, this morning begins with the exact same quiet ritual, just like yesterday. What makes this morning special is that nothing is special at all. But what seems ordinary to us today, the milk bottle on the doorstep, the smell of coffee rising from the kitchen, the morning news playing on the radio, was life itself for those who lived through it. And in just a few short years, most of these mornings would disappear forever. So let us take you back to a morning in 1962. For some of you, this won't just be a history lesson. It will be the story of your own childhood, your own kitchen, and your own street. The year 1962 was a strange moment of balance for America. On one hand, the post-World War II prosperity was still going strong. In the newly built suburbs outside the cities, families had achieved their own homes and their own cars. On the other hand, the world was holding its breath under the shadow of the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis, which would strike later that autumn, hadn't happened yet, but the tension was already in the air. Still, what woke people up in the morning wasn't fear, but routine. Coffee, the radio, the school bus, and a neighborly wave. During this time, most American families lived in these new neighborhoods called suburbs. Built after the war, these communities consisted of modest, similar-looking homes, each with a front yard, a garage, and usually a single car. The father went to work, while the mother managed the home and raised the children, a lifestyle frequently reflected on the television screens of the era. According to media researchers, most 1950s programming ignored current affairs and political debate, focusing instead on family-friendly domestic comedies that spotlighted white, middle-class, suburban families. By 1962, this picture was still on the airwaves, but the mood of society was slowly beginning to shift. Some historians point out that this lifestyle was an idealized image, and that many Americans were left out of this picture entirely, a diversity that the television of the time largely failed to represent. So, let us step into a morning like this together.
Between 5:30 and 6 in the morning, the first signs of life would begin in most American homes. Men usually got up early before heading to work, shaving, pressing their shirts. Women moved to the kitchen in the early hours to start breakfast preparations. As home management books of the time suggest, a housewife's morning routine was to wake up, get dressed, do her hair and makeup, and then prepare breakfast for herself and her husband. In some homes, bedsheets were aired out, curtains pulled back, letting the morning light pour in, a small, meaningful ritual marking the start of a new day. Right about then, another quiet ritual was taking place outside, the milk delivery. In the early 1960s, a significant number of American homes still received daily milk deliveries. According to agricultural records, home deliveries still accounted for nearly 30% of all milk sold in the 1960s. The milk truck would pull into the street. The milkman would quietly leave glass bottles in an insulated box by the front door or in a small cabinet built into the side of the house, pick up the empties, and move on. This system was a leftover habit from a time when not every family owned a powerful refrigerator. Or even if they did, fresh milk delivery was a source of trust and comfort. Yet, this lovely tradition was already quietly coming to an end. Suburban sprawl was stretching the milkman's route, driving up costs. What's more, most families now owned a car, and heading to the newly built supermarkets was becoming much easier than waiting for the milkman. Historical researchers note that suburban expansion lengthened delivery routes and raised costs, leading families to gradually incorporate milk into their regular grocery trips. In 1962, this shift wasn't complete just yet, but within a decade, the milk box on the porch would sit empty, and most families would be buying their milk at the store. As the sound of the milk truck faded away, another sound took its place, the rattle of a newspaper boy's bicycle. A young boy, usually one of the neighborhood kids, would drop a newspaper at every doorstep in the early hours. For many American boys back then, this was their first job, their very first step toward earning a little pocket money and taking on responsibility. Inside, the kitchen was slowly coming alive. The coffee pot bubbled away and the aroma of toasted bread filled the air. Even the appliances used to make breakfast were signs of a massive transformation. In the early 1960s, the American kitchen was almost unrecognizable compared to the previous generation. Refrigerators were now in nearly every home. Some families owned the new side-by-side models with a bottom freezer compartment. Researchers note that the side-by-side refrigerator introduced in 1949 reached the peak of its popularity in the mid-1960s thanks to advanced tech and frost-free features, allowing access to both the fridge and freezer without having to bend down.
On the breakfast table, the toaster was now a standard fixture. Operated by a simple push of a lever, this device allowed families to multitask without having to stand over a hot stove. Dishwashers weren't widespread in every home just yet. Some sources suggest they wouldn't truly become common until the 1970s, but portable models that didn't require permanent plumbing and simply hooked up to the sink faucet were beginning to find their way into kitchens. These small appliances reduced the time women spent on housework, but they also brought a new standard of what it meant to be a modern housewife. In 1962, the American breakfast table was a mix of the traditional and the brand new. Cereals were now an essential part of breakfast, with Kellogg's maintaining its dominant hold on the table. But the most talked about novelty that year was something else entirely, a powdered orange-flavored drink called Tang. Food history research shows that while Kellogg's dominated the table, Tang was the real talk of 1962. A few years later, this drink would become synonymous with NASA's space program. But in 1962, it was just a fresh new novelty sitting on an ordinary kitchen table. In some homes, breakfast took a more traditional form. Oatmeal, sweetened with cinnamon and brown sugar, topped with raisins. Children weren't given coffee. Instead, they were served a glass of orange juice and a glass of whole milk. Personal memoirs from the 1960s recall children often eating oatmeal, with mothers adding raisins, cinnamon, and a bit of brown sugar. Rather than coffee, children were served 4 ounces of orange juice alongside 8 ounces of whole milk. The radio would be playing at the table, morning news, the weather forecast, maybe a bit of music. Television wasn't turned on in the morning in every home just yet, but in the evenings, it was the central piece around which families gathered. Media researchers point out that television programming of the era mostly ignored current events and political issues, focusing instead on family-friendly domestic comedies centered around white, middle-class suburban families. Fantasy sitcoms like Bewitched and shows like The Beverly Hillbillies offered viewers a brief escape from real-world tensions. It's believed that the Cold War tensions and the upcoming Cuban Missile Crisis in the autumn of 1962 actually boosted the popularity of these lighthearted, escapist shows.
As soon as breakfast was over, the man of the house began the day's most familiar routine, getting ready for work. A pressed shirt, sometimes a hat, and the car waiting in the garage. The rapid rise in car ownership during the post-war era was the single most important factor that made suburban life possible. People could now live far from city centers and commute by car every morning. This was a level of freedom unimaginable to the previous generation, but it also meant the family was separated for most of the day. After the father walked out the door and the kids left for school, the house settled into a different rhythm. The table was cleared, dishes washed, and beds made. Home management sources from the period show that after breakfast, the table was cleared. Young children were dressed, dishes were washed by hand or in a new portable machine, and the living and dining rooms were tidied up. Simple as these chores might seem to us today, back then they filled a major part of a woman's day, requiring patience and hard work. On some days, this routine included a quick phone call or a brief chat with the local grocer. Small neighborhood shops still existed, but the rise of supermarkets was gradually changing how families shopped. For the kids, the morning started with a school bag,
maybe a breakfast sandwich, and the steady rhythm of the school bus or a walk to class. School back then was a place where discipline, order, and a sense of community were taught. Games played during recess, the respect shown to teachers, and time spent with neighborhood kids after school became a vital part of that generation's collective memory. Outside, the neighborhood came quietly alive. Neighbors exchanged morning greetings, sometimes stopping at the porch for a brief chat. Lawnmowers hadn't started up just yet, but plans for weekend yard work were already being discussed. Most of the homes looked alike: a small yard, a garage, a single or two-story structure. Built rapidly after the war, these neighborhoods represented a new way of living, giving middle-class families the chance to own their own homes. This was a calm, unhurried America, a world where everyone knew one another, and where the morning had a rhythm all its own. And that rhythm was surprisingly fragile. Within a decade, milk trucks would vanish from the streets, while supermarkets and automobiles reshaped daily life. The quiet radio chatter at the breakfast table would increasingly give way to television screens. The morning of 1962 was, without anyone realizing it, one of the final mornings of an older America.
When we look back at those mornings today, we aren't really talking about grand events, but small details. A bottle of milk, a cup of coffee, a news broadcast on the radio, a newspaper waiting on the doorstep. Yet, these tiny details were a shared memory for millions of Americans, a nation's morning routine, a ritual that quietly yet deeply brought people together. Perhaps you remember a morning like this too. Maybe you still recall the glass milk bottles left on your doorstep or the rich smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen. Those mornings belong to the past now, but they live on in our memories, warm, simple, and deeply precious. Times have changed, but the warmth of those mornings remains as fresh as ever.